The Act of Blood and Conscience, Abolition of the Slave Trade in the British Empire. The story of the abolition of the slave trade in the British Empire is far more than a simple narrative of moral awakening. It is a captivating and dramatic saga detailing the collision of an unprecedented popular will against monumental financial power. It recounts how the idealism of a handful of religious activists, amplified by public outrage, managed to dismantle the economic machinery that had fueled British global dominance for over a century. Yet, like any great historical victory, the triumph of 1807 was stained by compromise, hypocrisy, and a lasting financial legacy whose repercussions were felt for almost 2 centuries. Prologue. Anatomy of the Imperial Machine. The Economics of Inhumanity. By the late 18th century, as the abolitionist movement took root, the transatlantic slave trade, TAST, had reached its peak, operating as an industrial system, one that was fundamental to British prosperity. This trade provided the mass-forced labor that made the plantation economies of the Caribbean and North America hugely profitable. One between 1700 and 1807, British merchants who came to dominate the sector transported an estimated 1.5 to 1.9 million enslaved Africans. 2. The trade operated on the infamous triangular route. Goods, textiles, firearms, metal wares sailed from British ports to West Africa, where they were exchanged for human beings. These individuals were then transported across the Atlantic in conditions of unimaginable cruelty, known as the Middle Passage. Western English port cities flourished on this business. By 1750, Liverpool had surpassed Bristol and London to become the leading slave port. By the 1790s, Liverpool ships controlled 80% of the British trade and over 40% of the entire European slave trade. 4. The invisible presence and deep roots. The financial bedrock of the TAST was deeply integrated into the national economy. This was not the exclusive domain of a few greedy captains. London's money markets and insurance firms underpinned the entire sophisticated system. 1. The economy of cities like Bristol was literally built on the products of enslaved labor. The import of sugar, rum, indigo, and cocoa fed local industries, sugar refineries, tobacco factories, and chocolate manufacturers, which in turn employed thousands of white working-class people in the surrounding areas. The fight for abolition was thus a battle not against a fringe business, but against a powerful, organized, and geographically distributed economic oligarchy determined to protect its profits. An often overlooked context is the physical presence of Africans on British soil. By the late 18th century, an estimated 15,000 black people lived in England and Wales, both free and enslaved, primarily working in domestic service in London and the major port cities. 5. The presence of these individuals, many in chattel slavery, transformed the issue from an abstract overseas injustice into a tangible reality on British streets. The richly decorated grave of Scipio Africanus, dating to 1720 in Henbury churchyard, serves as a powerful, quiet symbol of how enslaved individuals, even in death, became permanent features of the English landscape. 6. 2. The Unexpected Architects, a Movement of Conscience. The Quaker Vow and the Legal Foothold. The origins of the movement to abolish the slave trade lay not in the halls of Parliament, but in radical religious communities and the courts. A key legal precedent was established by Somerset's case in 1772, when the courts ruled that slavery was unsupported by English common law within the Metropole. 7. While this did not free slaves in the colonies, it provided a vital legal foundation for the burgeoning movement. The true engine of the moral campaign was the Society of Friends, or Quakers. 10. They became the first religious body to officially condemn slavery and forbid their own members from owning slaves. Understanding that their voices would be marginalized in the House of Commons as nonconformists, Quakers were barred from holding parliamentary seats. They founded the Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade in 1787. 12 of the 12 founding members were Quakers. 14 to gain political leverage, they needed a parliamentary spokesperson. This critical role was filled by William Wilberforce, a devout Anglican MP who declared his mission, "God Almighty has set before me two great objects, the suppression of the slave trade and the reformation of manners." 15. His moral authority became the linchpin of the political debate. Thomas Clarkson and the campaign chest. If Wilberforce was the voice of the movement in Westminster, Thomas Clarkson was its tireless investigator and organizer. Clarkson essentially became the first investigative journalist of a mass movement. He traveled over 35,000 miles across England, relentlessly compiling irrefutable evidence. 17. He interviewed over 20,000 sailors, meticulously documenting the horrors on the slave ships and the appalling mortality rates among the British crews themselves. 17. For public persuasion, Clarkson employed an innovative tactic known as the campaign chest. 19. This chest contained physical evidence, instruments of torture, shackles used to bind enslaved people, and, crucially, examples of West African goods, including textiles woven on horizontal looms. 19. By displaying these artifacts, Clarkson achieved two aims. He shocked the public with graphic proof of the planters' cruelty, while simultaneously demonstrating that African peoples possessed sophisticated, viable cultures, offering a pragmatic economic argument for fair trade that bolstered the moral case. 21. These early abolitionists, unable to rely on direct political votes, pioneered a new form of political pressure, combining parliamentary lobbying, forensic fact-gathering, visual propaganda, such as the famous Wedgwood Medallion 7, and direct public action. Third, the battle for hearts and minds, narrative and boycott. The voice of the Middle Passage, Olaudah Equiano. One of the most powerful weapons in the abolitionists' arsenal was personal testimony. In 1789, the publication of The Interesting Narrative of the Life of Olaudah Equiano, or Gustavus Vasa, the African, stunned British society. 22. The book became a sensation, running through 9 British editions by 1794. Equiano, who survived capture and the horrors of the Middle Passage before purchasing his freedom, vividly detailed the inhumanity of the trade, appealing directly to the reader's empathy. He posed powerful questions asking, "Is it not enough that we are torn from our country and friends? Why are parents to lose their children, brothers their sisters, or husbands their wives? Surely this is a new refinement in cruelty." 25. His account of sailors tossing their leftover catch overboard, denying the starving captives any sustenance, became a potent symbol of the trade's irrational brutality. 28. Equiano was also politically pragmatic. In his later chapters, he moved beyond moral condemnation to present a compelling economic argument, asserting that abolition would benefit Britain itself. Point 31. He claimed that free trade with resource-rich Africa, which he called an endless field of commerce, would enhance the prosperity of British manufacturing and merchant interests, resulting in a universal good. 31. This pragmatism was vital in helping abolitionists translate a moral imperative into a matter of national economic interest, thereby undermining the planters' financial arguments. The weapon of the people, the sugar boycott. In 1791, abolitionists launched another groundbreaking tactic, a mass consumer boycott of sugar, the first major movement of its kind in modern history. 34 activists, who called themselves anti-Saccharites, attacked sugar consumption as an inherently immoral activity. 34. The boycott became a powerful tool for the democratization of politics. Since suffrage was limited, it allowed those traditionally excluded from political power, especially women who controlled household purchases, to engage directly in national policy making. 14 women became the driving force, with pendants bearing the phrase, "Am I not a sister and a woman?" widely circulated. 14. Meanwhile, a more expensive free labor sugar, imported from India, became available on the market. 34. Tellingly, even children demonstrated significant, sometimes independent agency in refusing slave-grown sugar, intensifying the moral pressure on adults and politicians alike. 37. This unprecedented surge in moral activism, fueled by Clarkson's facts and Equiano's testimony, created a critical mass of public opinion that made political victory achievable. Fourth, 1807, Parliamentary Triumph and the Great Paradox. The climax and geopolitical calculation. After 18 years of continuous struggle, during which Wilberforce's bill was repeatedly defeated by the powerful West India lobby, the political landscape finally shifted. On March 25, 1807, the Slave Trade Act was passed, prohibiting the transportation of slaves within the British Empire. The act took full effect on May 1, 1807. This victory, however, was secured not only by moral triumph, but also by political expediency. The ongoing war against Napoleonic France provided crucial cover. Since Napoleon had reinstated slavery in the French colonies in 1802, Britain gained a significant moral high ground over its primary rival by passing the act. Abolition thus became a convenient diplomatic weapon for London, allowing it to pursue a moral crusade abroad while facing military opposition on the continent. 9. Morality and geopolitics converged at the perfect moment to ensure the bill's passage. Debunking the myth, economic decline versus moral fury. The passage of the 1807 Act was long explained by historian Eric Williams's famous thesis, which argued that abolition was driven purely by economic self-interest. The slave trade and Caribbean plantations were supposedly in decline, and British capital was simply shifting to more profitable areas like Asia. 40. However, later research largely refuted this narrow view. Historian Seymour Drescher introduced the term econicide, arguing that the slave trade remained profitable in 1807 and Parliament enacted an act of economic sacrifice by yielding to unprecedented popular moral pressure. 41. Abolition was the result of the moral outrage of the British public which could vote. 42. The facts confirm that economic interest in slave labor did not vanish. After 1807, Britain became paradoxically more dependent on slave-grown cotton from the United States, as British textile factories boomed using American raw material. In 1803, only 8% of imported cotton was not slave-produced. 33. This demonstrates that the abolition of the transatlantic trade was not an act of economic convenience, but a profound moral shift that allowed the political class to overcome a powerful, yet politically obsolete, lobby. The Act's aftermath, the long road to full freedom, unfinished business, and the naval war. The 1807 Act, while monumental, was only a first step. It prohibited the trade, but not the institution of slavery, which remained legal in British colonies for another 26 years until the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833. 7. To enforce the new law, the Royal Navy established the West Africa Squadron. This mission, described as the most expensive international humanitarian intervention in modern history, was incredibly dangerous. Between 1807 and 1860, the squadron seized approximately 1,600 ships and liberated around 150,000 Africans. Tragically, during this same period, approximately 1,600 British sailors died, primarily from tropical disease. Despite these heroic efforts, the illegal trade persisted. Traders circumvented the law by fitting out ships in British ports and then sailing under the flags of nations that had not yet abolished the trade, such as Spain or Portugal. 21. Most shockingly, British capital continued to finance and equip vessels that transported millions of Africans after 1808 to plantations in Brazil and Spanish colonies like Cuba. 21. This duality reveals a deep institutional hypocrisy. The state waged a moral war while private financial interests cynically continued to fuel global slavery. The bitter cost of freedom, compensation. The culmination of the abolitionist saga was the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833, which freed over 800,000 enslaved Africans. 44. However, freedom came at a bitter price. To overcome the resistance of the colonial lobby, the government agreed to a monumental compromise, paying slave owners compensation for the loss of their property. 44. The compensation totaled an astronomical £20 million, the equivalent of 40% of the entire British government's annual national budget. 45. This money was distributed to about 3,000 British slave-owning families. 0.48 beneficiaries included the ancestors of many prominent British figures, whose families received massive sums that helped fund country houses and art collections. 49. The liberated slaves, meanwhile, received nothing. This act of historical injustice was financed by a massive government loan. The debt incurred in 1833 to compensate slave owners was so enormous that British taxpayers continued to pay the interest and principal on that debt until 2015.45. Thus, the descendants of the slave owners received compensation, while the descendants of the enslaved received only their freedom, a freedom paid for by 182 years of subsequent generations of British citizens. London banks and merchant firms played a key role as intermediaries, quickly converting the government stock awarded to slave owners into cash, profiting handsomely through commission fees. 6. Conclusion. Echoes of an incomplete victory. The Slave Trade Act of 1807 was a historic turning point, marking an unprecedented moral triumph achieved through the efforts of religious activists, investigative journalism, and mass consumer protest. It proved that organized public opinion could overcome powerful and entrenched economic interests, even when those interests were not in decline. However, the history of British abolitionism is complex and morally ambiguous. The 1807 victory was a product of both genuine moral fervor and political opportunism, using the Napoleonic Wars to gain diplomatic leverage. The subsequent Royal Navy mission, paid for in sailors' lives, ran parallel to British financial capital that cynically continued to support slavery outside the empire. 21. Most significantly, abolition in 1833 was secured at the cost of a staggering historical injustice. The state paid for freedom by recognizing the legal right to human property and imposing that immense financial burden on future generations of taxpayers. 45. Furthermore, the legal eradication of all forms of slavery in the farthest reaches of the empire dragged on for nearly a century and a half, with the final acts of abolition only occurring as late as 1937. The Act of 1807, therefore, should be viewed not as a conclusion, but as the turbulent start of a long, dramatic, and contradictory journey where moral principles continually battled the inertia of capital and the cold pragmatism of imperial policy. The Slave Trade Act of 1807 was, in every sense, a moral earthquake, a monumental victory for the power of popular conscience over a deeply entrenched economic oligarchy. It proved that organized public will, fueled by the facts of Thomas Clarkson and the painful testimony of Olaudah Equiano, could force Parliament to sacrifice profits for principles. But the story doesn't end there. The subsequent abolition of slavery in 1833 came with a staggering price. The government paid £20 million, 40% of the national budget, as compensation to the 3,000 slave owners for the loss of their property. Meanwhile, the descendants of the enslaved received only their freedom. Here is the most shocking fact that connects this history directly to the modern day. That immense debt, taken out in 1833 to compensate the owners, was finally paid off by British taxpayers, your grandparents, perhaps your parents, in the year 2015. For nearly 2 centuries, freedom was financially underwritten by generations of citizens. That is the long, morally ambiguous shadow of this historic victory. We've analyzed the bitter compromise. The state chose to recognize human ownership to secure a peaceful abolition. But what would you have done? If you were William Wilberforce in 1833, facing the choice between paying £20 million to the owners or risking immediate, potentially violent emancipation, which path ensures true justice? Let me know your stance on the compensation paradox in the comments below. If this deep dive into the true, complex price of freedom has highlighted a part of the story that you never knew about, click on the like button. Your support helps us refute myths and uncover the real, often unpleasant forces that have shaped our world. And to find out more stories that bring the story to life, be sure to subscribe and click on the notification bell. Thanks for joining us, and I'll see you next time right here on the Edge of History.